The snow fell like forgotten promises, blanketing the village square in a hush that swallowed all sound. Laura stood there, her coat pulled tight against the creeping chill, her breath blooming in fragile clouds that dissipated into the gray twilight. The world felt paused, a still life painting where nothing moved but the flakes drifting down each one, a tiny ghost of winter's indifference. She had come out for air, or perhaps to escape the suffocating quiet of her cottage, but now her eyes caught at a line of paw prints etched into the fresh powder weaving toward the shadowed alley like a secret invitation. Her heart stuttered not with fear exactly, but with that old pull of curiosity, the one that whispered of stories untold. Why here, why now, she thought, her fingers flexing in her gloves, as if the prints were a thread she could tug to unravel her own unraveling life. The village sprawled like a frozen beast, its rooftops bowed under the weight of snow, streets empty, save for the occasional gust that stirred eddies of white like restless spirits. Houses huddled together, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight, but the warmth inside felt mocking, unreachable. Laura's boots crunched softly as she followed the paw prints, each step sinking into the cold embrace of the ground, the sound echoing in her ears like a heartbeat too slow to sustain life. The tracks veered past the miller's cottage, where whispers of a stolen heirloom brooch had circulated last week, then skirted the edge of the old bakery, its door still marked by the faint outline of forced entry from another unexplained theft. The wind howled through bare branches overhead, carrying the distant mournful cry of a dog, perhaps the very one leaving these marks. It all mirrored her inner desolation, this place where secrets buried themselves in snow, only to resurface in patterns that hinted at deeper wounds. What if these prints led to nothing but more emptiness? She wondered, her gaze tracing the trail into the gathering dark, where shadows loomed like unspoken regrets. Laura's steps faltered as the paw prints deepened her mind, a whirlwind of fragments from a life that had shattered like glass underfoot. She remembered the newsroom betrayal, the colleague who had pilfered her investigative piece on corporate fraud, claiming it as his own, leaving her discredited and exiled to this forgotten village. The words "plagiarized" echoed in her head, a silent scream. She never voiced her career reduced to freelance scraps that barely paid the rent. Why chase this now? She thought, her gloved hands clenching involuntarily, the cold biting through like the numbness that had settled in her chest since that day. She walked on autopilot, boots dragging through the snow, each crunch a reminder of her isolation. No family, no friends left after the fallout. Just the hollow routine of solitary evenings, staring at blank screens. Her breath came shallow, eyes fixed on the tracks as if they were a lifeline. Yet her body betrayed her, a slight tremble in her knees, a hesitation at every turn, paralyzed by the fear that this mystery, like everything else, would only deepen her despair. The village lights blurred in her vision, not from snow, but from the unshed tears. She refused to acknowledge her curiosity, a fragile mask over the void within. The paw prints halted abruptly at the edge of a dilapidated shed, its door ajar like a wound half healed. Laura paused, the wind whispering through the cracks, carrying a faint scent of damp fur and earth. Something shifted in the shadows. Within, two amber eyes gleamed like embers in the gloom, fixed on her with an intensity that pierced the cold. It was a German shepherd, silent and still, his scarred muzzle barely visible, watching as if weighing her soul. Her pulse thundered, a mix of awe and trepidation. This wasn't just a stray, but a harbinger promising upheaval in her stagnant world. Before she could whisper a word, the dog melted back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his gaze, a subtle vow that their paths would cross again, pulling her toward an unknown dawn. In the flickering glow of her cottage lamp, Laura's mind drifted back like smoke from a dying fire, pulling her into the chaos of her former life. She had been a force once, a journalist with ink in her veins, chasing stories through bustling city newsrooms, where the clatter of keyboards was a symphony of purpose. Her breakthrough piece on corporate embezzlement had been her pinnacle, nights spent poring over leaked documents, the thrill of uncovering truths that could topple empires, her name whispered in admiration among peers. But then came the betrayal. Her closest colleague, a man she'd mentored, lifted her work wholesale, presenting it as his own under the bright lights of a press conference. The plagiarism scandal erupted like a storm, her protests drowned in accusations of jealousy, her credibility shattered into irreparable shards. Fired and blacklisted, she fled to this snowbound village, renting a drafty cottage on the outskirts where the walls seemed to absorb her screams of rage until only silence remained. Now, as she traced the memory of those paw prints in her mind, that old fire flickered weakly, a spark of curiosity amid the ashes, reminding her of the woman who once believed truth was worth any cost. But doubt crept in like frost on a window pane. What if this mystery was just another illusion, another theft of her fragile hope? Her fingers clenched around a cold mug of tea, the steam rising like ghosts of her lost ambitions, leaving her to wonder if she could ever reclaim the blaze that had defined her. Laura's days unfolded like a worn reel of film stuck in an endless loop of muted existence within the confines of her cottage. Mornings began with the mechanical drip of coffee into a chipped mug, the bitter scent mingling with the musty air of unread books, stacked like forgotten sentinels on sagging shelves. She would sit at her desk, staring at the blank screen of her laptop fingers hovering over keys that once flew with fervor, now paralyzed by the echo of that stolen story. Afternoons blurred into walks along snow-choked paths, her boots leaving solitary tracks that the wind erased before dusk, mirroring the way her life had been wiped clean of meaning. Evenings were the worst silence, pressing in like a heavy blanket broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant hoot of an owl, her defense against the void, a ritual of scrolling through old articles, avoiding the mirror that reflected hollow eyes and lines etched by regret. The cottage itself was a reflection of her numbness. Bare walls devoid of photos, a single chair at the table as if company were an unwelcome intruder, the hearth cold and unused, much like the passion she kept locked away. Yet the paw prints lingered in her thoughts, a subtle disruption to this frozen routine, whispering that perhaps there was still a puzzle worth solving, a thread to pull before she fully surrendered to the ice within. In the dim recesses of memory, Shadow's life began, not in the soft cradle of a litter, but in the harsh clang of chains and barbed wire where he was forged into a weapon rather than a companion. Bred for guarding a rundown warehouse on the city's fringes, his days were a blur of commands barked like thunderclaps, his German shepherd frame muscular and alert, twisted into a tool of intimidation. The scars on his muzzle told the story in jagged lines, whips that cracked for the slightest hesitation, muzzles clamped too tight to stifle his instinctive barks, teaching him that sound brought only pain. He learned silence as survival, his voice retreating deep within like a river gone underground, emerging only in faint whines during the loneliest nights. Betrayed by handlers who saw him as disposable, he endured beatings that left his ribs bruised and his spirit fractured, his wary eyes reflecting the same guarded emptiness that now haunted Laura's gaze. One storm-lashed evening, Ethan found him chained outside rain, sluicing over his trembling form, a discarded shadow on the verge of breaking. As Laura wandered the snow-veiled paths, replaying the glimpse of those amber eyes, she felt an uncanny resonance, as if the dog's silent vigil mirrored the hollow chambers of her own heart. Both moved through the world like ghosts unseen, unheard, flinching at the crack of a branch or the slam of a distant door, their bodies wired for threats that lingered like fog. Shadow's wary glances from the shadows echoed Laura's averted eyes in conversations. She avoided each hesitation a barrier against further pain. He would freeze at approaching footsteps, muscles coiled like springs just as she tensed when her phone buzzed with reminders of her past life. Their emptiness intertwined in subtle ways, Shadow's scarred form curling into tight balls during sleep, protecting vital spots, paralleled Laura's habit of hugging her knees in the dim cottage light, warding off the chill of isolation. Slowly, as she followed faint traces of his tracks the next day, a recognition dawned not in words, but in the shared language of vulnerability. She paused at a crossroads, sensing his presence nearby, and for a fleeting moment their gazes met across the white expanse, his eyes holding a depth of mistrust that reflected her own. It was a quiet acknowledgement, two souls adrift in parallel storms, beginning to see in each other the possibility of anchor their mutual wounds, a bridge rather than a divide forged in the silence that bound them. The blizzard descended like a vengeful specter, whipping snow into frenzied veils that blurred the line between earth and sky. Laura had ventured out again, drawn by the insistent tug of those paw prints, fresh ones etched into the morning's thin crust, leading her beyond the village's edge toward a derelict barn, sagging under winter's burden. Her coat flapped wildly, the wind howling through gaps in the wooden walls like lost souls wailing for release, each gust pelting her face with icy needles that stung like accusations. She shouldn't be here. She knew her cottage waited safe and empty, but the tracks compelled her a silent siren's call through the chaos. Visibility shrank to arm's length, the world a swirling white abyss trapping her in its maw as her boots sank deeper, legs aching from the fight against the drifts. Then amid the roar, a shape materialized in the barn's yawning doorway. Shadow the German shepherd, his fur-matted and frosted body gaunt like a shadow stretched too thin. He shivered violently, ribs visible beneath his scarred hide, but his amber eyes locked onto hers with a raw intensity, pleading yet defiant, as if daring her to turn away. The storm's fury amplified the moment the creak of the barn's beams, a tense underscore, her heart pounding in sync with the thunderous gusts. Shock rippled through her, visual and visceral. This creature, so broken yet enduring, mirrored her own fragile stand against the tempests within. Urgency surged like adrenaline in her veins. The blizzard closed in, forcing a crossroads, leave him to the cold's mercy or bridge the chasm of her isolation. Shadow's gaze held unblinking, a silent storm of his own brewing in those depths, pulling her toward the precipice of choice. Laura froze in the blizzard's grip, her mind a battlefield where fear clashed with an unwelcome surge of pity. Shadow stood there, a shivering silhouette against the barn's gloom, his eyes boring into hers like anchors in a sea of white chaos. Why me? She thought, logic rearing like a shield. She was no rescuer, barely piecing together her own fractured existence after the betrayal that had stolen her voice and trust. Involvement meant risk, opening doors to pain, to the mess of caring, when her heart was still raw, guarded like a fortress against further sieges. Yet compassion whispered, insidious and warm, stirring memories of her own abandonment, the cold isolation that mirrored Shadow's gaunt frame. He shifted, a faint whine escaping his scarred muzzle, a rare fracture in his silence piercing the storm's din like a cry from her buried self. It tipped the scales, empathy flooding in against the tide of self-preservation, her internal argument crumbling under the weight of his vulnerability. She couldn't be the savior she never had, but perhaps in this moment she could be something, anything, to halt the cycle of neglect echoing between them. With the blizzard's fury clawing at her resolve, Laura made the choice in a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Her hands, numb and trembling, fumbled with the buttons of her coat, peeling it open like a reluctant bloom in winter's grasp. "Come on," she urged silently, her internal voice a mix of desperation and defiance, as if speaking to both the dog and the fractured parts of herself. Shadow hesitated, his body, a taut wire of mistrust, amber eyes flicking between her and the swirling white void outside the barn, where snow piled like forgotten regrets. She knelt slowly, the cold seeping through her knees like doubt, extending a gloved hand, palm up, an offering as imperfect as her own scarred heart. The wind howled through the cracks, flinging flakes that clung to her lashes and soaked her sweater, turning the moment into a messy tableau of vulnerability. Her breath ragged his flanks, heaving the air thick with the scent of wet fur and pine rot. He inched forward, one paw at a time, his scarred muzzle twitching as if testing the air for betrayal, a low rumble in his throat that dissolved into silence. When his nose brushed her fingers, cool and tentative, it was the spark, an irreversible tether snapping into place, commitment flooding her like warmth from a distant fire. Shadow pressed closer, seeking the shelter of her coat, his body shuddering against hers in cautious surrender. She wrapped the fabric around him as best she could, snow melting into rivulets down her back, the act clumsy yet profound, a bridge built from impulse over the chasm of their shared isolation. As she stood, he followed his steps, mirroring hers through the drifts, a fragile bond weaving itself in the storm's chaos, pulling them toward an uncertain haven. The journey back to the cottage was a blur of white fury and labored steps, Laura's arm draped protectively over Shadow's back as they battled the blizzard's relentless assault, each gust a reminder of the world's indifference. Her coat, now sodden and heavy, clung to them both like a shared shroud, the snow crunching underfoot in rhythmic protest, while the wind whispered taunts of isolation through the bare trees. Inside her mind, doubts swirled like the flakes. What have I done? This dog with his silent scars was no simple stray. He carried an aura of mystery, perhaps danger tied to those enigmatic paw prints that had haunted the village. Yet as they pushed through the door, the warmth of the hearth flickering weakly against the chill, a quiet determination settled in her chest. Shadow shook off the snow in a spray of crystals, his eyes scanning the sparse room, the bare walls, the single chair like a sentinel assessing threats before curling into a tight ball in the corner, his body a fortress of wariness. Laura moved with impulsive care, filling a bowl with water from the tap, its drip echoing in the silence and scraping leftover stew into another, the savory scent mingling with the musty air. He didn't approach it first, his gaze tracking her every motion, amber depths reflecting the same guarded vulnerability she saw in her own reflection. Kneeling at a respectful distance, she pushed the bowls forward, her hands steady, despite the tremor within, whispering softly, "You're safe here. I promise no more cold, no more alone." The words hung in the air, a vow born of her own unmet needs, sealing the impulsive act into something irreversible. Shadow's ears twitched, and slowly he uncurled just enough to lap at the water, a faint sign of acceptance rippling through the room like the first crack in ice. Unaware yet of the thefts woven into his past, the hidden jewels, Ethan's clandestine schemes this moment, forged a silent bond fragile as new frost, where trust began to bud in the shared space of their healing, a promise echoing in the quiet crackle of the fire. In the dim glow of the cottage's single lamp, Shadow claimed his corner like a sentinel staking territory in enemy lands, his body coiled into a tight ball of fur and tension-scarred muzzle tucked beneath a paw as if hiding from the world. Laura moved with deliberate slowness, her footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards, aware that any sudden noise could shatter the fragile truce forged in the blizzard's chaos. He didn't growl outright, but his amber eyes tracked her every motion, pouring tea, stoking the fire with a wariness that mirrored her own internal walls, built high after the betrayal that had left her voice stolen and her trust in tatters. The air hung heavy with unspoken boundaries. She placed his water bowl at arm's length, retreating to her chair without a word, respecting the invisible line he drew around himself. Shadow's ears flicked at the faintest sounds, the pop of embers, the wind's sigh against the window, but he remained distant, his silence a fortress much like Laura's habit of eating alone, gaze fixed on the flames rather than risking eye contact that might invite vulnerability. Neither initiated. She didn't coo or call. Sensing his need for space echoed her own aversion to forced intimacy, the cottage a shared sanctuary of guarded solitude. Nights passed this way, the clock ticking like a hesitant heartbeat, their presences parallel shadows in the flickering light, each testing the waters of coexistence without diving in. Laura's thoughts wandered to her empty newsroom days, the isolation that had become armor, shadows to the chains of his past where closeness meant pain. Yet in this mutual reticence, a subtle understanding bloomed, two souls orbiting, not colliding, their cold distance, a quiet prelude to the warmth that might one day follow. As days blurred into a rhythm of quiet coexistence, Laura noticed the gash on Shadow's paw, a ragged line crusted with dirt from his nocturnal wanderings, mirroring the invisible scars she carried from her shattered career. She approached with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, her movements telegraphed like a peace offering, kneeling at a distance, while he watched from his corner body tense as coiled wire. No words passed between them, his silence a given, hers a choice born of empathy, but as she dipped the cloth and gently extended it, Shadow uncurled slightly, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight like guarded lanterns. He allowed her touch, flinching at first, a soft whine escaping his muzzle that echoed her own suppressed sighs of pain. The wound cleaned slowly, the water turning pink with shared history, his paw trembling under her steady hand, much like her fingers had shaken when signing her resignation papers. Later, during a sparse meal of stew, she tore off scraps and placed them near him, retreating to eat her portion by the window, the steam rising like unspoken confessions. Shadow observed his nose twitching at the savory scent before inching forward to nibble their eyes, meeting briefly in a moment of mutual recognition, the way his body leaned away, yet stayed paralleling her habit of leaning into stories while keeping her heart at bay. In these small acts, their wounds aligned his physical marks, a map of abuse, hers emotional craters from betrayal, fostering a connection through presence rather than pursuit. The cottage walls, absorbing their silent suffering like a confessional. Shadow's watchful gaze softened imperceptibly, a distant observer turning participant, as Laura felt the first thaw in her isolation, their shared pain weaving threads of understanding in the quiet spaces between. The cottage air grew thick with the scent of brewing tea one evening, steam curling like forgotten memories as Laura reached for a mug on the high shelf, her fingers brushing it just enough to send it tumbling. It shattered on the floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet space, shards scattering like fragments of her broken trust. Shadow from his corner tensed instantly, his body-rigid ears flattened, a low whine escaping his scarred muzzle, as if the sound yanked him back to chains and whips, the abuse that had silenced him long ago. Laura froze, her heart pounding, the noise triggering her own cascade of echoes, the slam of the newsroom door after her betrayal, the colleague's smug voice claiming her words as his, leaving her voiceless and adrift. She knelt slowly amid the debris, sweeping the pieces with trembling hands, her eyes meeting Shadow's across the room, his amber gaze wide with mirrored fear, no longer recoiling, but pausing, as if recognizing the shared fracture in her flinch. In that suspended moment, a gentle gesture emerged. She extended a shard-free hand, palm up, not forcing, but inviting, and Shadow's whine softened to a breath, his head tilting in quiet acknowledgement. The connection deepened without utterance, the broken mug a catalyst tying their pasts, his physical scars to her emotional ones, building an invisible bridge where trust began to mend the cracks, one hesitant glance at a time. Sunlight pierced the cottage window for the first time in days, casting golden pools on the floor that danced like tentative hope amid the lingering chill. Laura, stirring from her chair with a blanket draped over her shoulders, noticed a stray leaf skittering across the threshold, carried in by a gentle breeze through the cracked door. Shadow, ever watchful from his corner, perked his ears, his scarred muzzle twitching as instinct took hold. With a sudden burst, he lunged playfully, paws batting at the leaf in a whirl of fur and rustles, his tail flicking, not wagging fully, but hinting at forgotten joy. Laura watched transfixed, a soft chuckle escaping her lips like a long-held breath released the sound foreign yet warming in the quiet space, echoing the laughter she once shared in bustling newsrooms before betrayal silenced it. The moment thawed something within her, a spark igniting in her chest. As Shadow paused, Leaf pinned his amber eyes, meeting hers with a glint of shared mischief. Emboldened, she tore a piece of bread from her plate, holding it out in her palm, the crust warm and inviting. He approached cautiously, nose sniffing the air laced with yeast and safety, before gently taking it from her hand, his rough tongue brushing her skin like a whisper of acceptance. The cottage transformed subtly, the walls seemed less confining. The fire's crackle more comforting as their ease grew small gestures, weaving warmth, her soft hum, while tidying his body, uncurling to stretch in the sunbeam. Laughter lingered in her throat, a fleeting warmth that mirrored Shadow's relaxing flanks, the space between them shrinking as joy flickered to life, a fragile flame against the shadows of their pasts. The cottage's peace fractured subtly at first like hairline cracks in a frozen pond as night cloaked the village in velvet darkness. Shadow, who had grown accustomed to curling at Laura's feet, stirred restlessly, his ears twitching at phantom sounds beyond the window's frost-etched glass. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not aggressive, but alert, his body tensing into a statue of primal instinct, hackles rising like shadows come alive. Laura, reading by the dim lamp, felt the shift, a chill, unrelated to the winter air seeping through cracks, her own skin prickling as if the room's warmth had been siphoned away. Outside, the snow lay still, but Shadow paced now, nose to the floor, sniffing at the door's base where faint paw prints, fresh unfamiliar, circled in the moonlight like ominous runes. His eyes, once soft with trust, narrowed to slits, barking sharply at shadows that danced from swaying branches, echoes of his abusive past, resurfacing like ghosts in the quiet. Laura's heart quickened. Memories of her betrayal stirring unease, the subtle tension coiling tighter as Shadow froze, staring into the void, sensing the threat long before it whispered her name. The subtle unease in the cottage thickened like gathering storm clouds, Shadow's low growls evolving into a protective snarl that vibrated through the floorboards, his hackles raised like a ridge of shadowed thorns. Laura set down her book, her pulse quickening as a figure emerged from the snow-shrouded night outside the window. Ethan, the reclusive old man from the village's edge, his weathered face etched with lines of guilt and desperation, eyes hollow as forgotten wells. Shadow's reaction was visceral, body coiling like a spring, his scarred muzzle peeling back in a silent threat rooted deep in trauma, memories of chains and commands flooding back like dark waters rising. Laura's own ghosts stirred the betrayal in the newsroom flashing before her, the colleague's face smug and thieving, stealing her words as Ethan had commandeered Shadow for his clandestine thefts. The dog's aggression turned maternal, positioning himself between Laura and the door, a shield born of loyalty forged in their shared healing, his growls echoing the panic she felt when her career crumbled. Ethan knocked the sound a thunderclap in the tense air, his presence triggering a cascade of emotion. Shadow's whines intermingling with barks, revealing glimpses of the abuse under Ethan's rescue, the hidden jewels, a twisted legacy of his daughter's loss. Laura's hands shook as she approached the door, flooded with a mix of fear and recognition, the abuser's shadow lengthening, pulling both her and Shadow into a vortex of resurfaced pain, their bond tested in the raw flood of history's tide. The door creaked open like a reluctant confession, admitting Ethan into the cottage's flickering warmth, his boots tracking snow that melted into accusatory puddles on the floor. Shadow's snarl deepened a primal rumble that filled the room, his body low and tensed for a lunge, amber eyes locked on the old man with immediate recognition, the trainer who had twisted rescue into control, using him for nocturnal deliveries of stolen heirlooms disguised as mundane objects. Laura stood frozen, her heart a war drum, as Ethan's gaze shifted from the dog to her, his face crumpling under the weight of guilt, the accident that claimed his daughter haunting his every line like shadows in cracked earth. "He's mine," Ethan rasped, voice gravelly with desperation, stepping forward only to halt as Shadow advanced, teeth bared in a silent vow of protection, the standoff electric with unspoken histories. The door clicked shut behind Ethan like the final breath of a dying wind, leaving the cottage steeped in a silence that pulsed with the aftermath's raw ache. Laura slumped against the wall, her body heavy with the weight of revelations, Ethan's confessions of thefts born from grief, the jewels hidden like buried sins, his retreat a shadow dissolving into the snow. Regret clawed at her throat, not for him, but for the fragility exposed in the standoff, her voice still echoing with accusations that tasted like ash. Shadow flanks heaving from his protective snarls, paced briefly before stopping, his amber eyes searching hers in the dim firelight, a silent question hanging between them like mist. Moonlight filtered through the cottage curtains like fractured silver, casting elongated shadows that danced uneasily across the walls, as if the night itself harbored secrets waiting to uncoil. Laura stirred in her chair, a mug of cooling tea, forgotten in her hand, the quiet of the evening disrupted by Shadow's sudden alertness, his ears perking like sentinels, body tensing from his spot by the hearth. A faint crunch echoed outside, snow compacting under weight too deliberate to be wind or wildlife, pulling her gaze to the window, where fresh paw prints, not Shadow's, broader and erratic, circled the perimeter like accusatory fingers. Instinct surged through Shadow, a low whine escaping his muzzle before he rose, hackles bristling like a ridge of midnight thorns, pacing to the door with watchful eyes that gleamed in the dim light. The cottage door burst inward with a splintering crack, the blizzard's howl mingling with the intruder's ragged breaths as Ethan's accomplice, a burly figure cloaked in shadows and desperation, stormed inside, eyes wild like cornered beasts. "Where are they?" he snarled, voice a gravelly thunder that shattered the fragile peace, his hands clutching a crowbar that gleamed dully in the firelight, demanding the stolen jewels hidden in plain sight, rings masquerading as keychains, brooches pinned to curtains. Laura backed against the wall, her heart slamming like a trapped bird, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and snowmelt, as Shadow positioned himself before her hackles, a ridge of fury growls rolling deep and unyielding. In the heart of the maelstrom, with the accomplice's crowbar raised for a fatal strike, and Shadow's blood staining the floor like crimson accusations, Laura's world narrowed to a single crystalline decision: protect or perish. Her fingers closed around the fire poker, heavy and cold, like the weight of her past betrayals, but now transformed into a weapon of resolve. She swung with a cry that tore from her throat, raw and primal, connecting with the intruder's shoulder in a thud that echoed her reclaiming of agency. Shadow, wounded but unyielding, surged forward in tandem jaws, locking onto the man's leg, a fierce guardian turning the tide from defense to defiance, their synchronized actions a testament to the bond forged in vulnerability. The sirens faded into the night like receding echoes of a nightmare, leaving the cottage wrapped in a hush that settled softly like fresh snow blanketing old scars. Laura knelt on the floor amid the splintered remnants of the struggle, her hands steady now as she pressed a clean cloth to Shadow's grazed side, the fabric blooming red before she bound it with gentle wraps, each motion deliberate and unhurried. The air hung heavy with the scent of iron and smoke, the fire in the hearth crackling faintly, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls in slow, rhythmic pauses. Shadow lay still, his flanks rising and falling in measured breaths, amber eyes half-lidded as he watched her, the tension draining from his frame like water from thawing ice. She moved with minimal grace, fetching water, dabbing at her own bruises, long sentences of silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the soft rustle of bandages and the distant drip of melting snow from the eaves. Survival lingered in the atmosphere, fragile and profound, a quiet reflection pooling in her mind. The jewels recovered, the accomplice hauled away. Ethan's web unraveled, yet the emotional void tugged at her edges, a reminder of vulnerabilities exposed. Shadow shifted slightly, a soft whine escaping as she adjusted the wrap, his head resting on her knee in wordless gratitude, the moment a tender decompression where words felt unnecessary, the peace of fragile return to the sanctuary they had built. Days unfolded in the cottage like pages turning in a well-worn book, each one layering subtle strokes of recovery over the raw canvas of their ordeal. Laura rose with the dawn's pale light filtering through frost-kissed windows, her steps soft as she prepared a simple meal. Scraps of bread and meat warmed by the hearth, the savory aroma weaving through the air like threads of normalcy. Shadow followed her movements with a steady gaze, his scarred form trailing her from room to room, no longer confined to corners, but mirroring her path with a quiet synchronicity, his paws padding in rhythm to her own. She offered food from her hand fingers, brushing his muzzle in a tactile exchange that spoke volumes, his tongue lapping gently the warmth of his breath, a sensory anchor grounding her scattered thoughts. Evenings brought them to the fireside where she sat cross-legged, her hand resting on his back, feeling the steady tempo of his heartbeat echo her own slowing pulse, interwoven behaviors, fostering a bond that deepened silently over time. Small gestures accumulated like snowflakes into drifts, a lingering eye contact across the room, his head tilting in response to her soft murmurs, the way he leaned into her during quiet walks outside, snow crunching underfoot in unison. Laura's emotional scars softened, mirrored in Shadow's relaxing flanks, and the absence of flinches at sudden sounds, their mutual healing, a sensory tapestry, the crackle of fire, the brush of fur, the shared warmth extracting them from isolation's grip. As weeks passed, the rhythm steadied emotions and actions blending in a dance of recovery, his presence a constant, her care, a reciprocal balm forging resilience from the fragments of their pasts. Snow fell softly outside the cottage, blanketing the village in a hush that felt like renewal, each flake a whisper of forgotten pains dissolving into white. Laura stood at the door, coat draped over her shoulders, her breath clouding the air like fleeting thoughts of the chaos past the thefts unraveled Ethan's shadow, a distant murmur in her mind. Shadow, she called softly, the name hanging like a delicate thread, her voice laced with the quiet hope that had bloomed from their shared trials.